Let us now look at balance, another of the principles of art. Visual balance can be felt intuitively, but as students of art, we must look into it more deeply so that we can think critically about it. In assessing visual balance, you can imagine that there's a vertical axis line that is drawn down through the center of an image, or the center of the sculpture, if you'd like. Then we look for an equilibrium between the two sides. And this does not mean that you need to have the same things going on in both sides in order for there to be balance. There are three categories to consider when we speak of balance. And these three categories are represented by these diagrammatic drawings. There's symmetrical balance here. We can see the line down the center. There's asymmetrical balance, two things opposite of one another, and radial balance. Let's look at all of these. First off, symmetry. If we look at the above fresco entitled School of Athens by Raphael, you'll notice that the convergence of one point perspective leads you to the center of the image. Now, I'll explain more about perspective a little bit later on. But what I mean by that is that you're looking into this deep space here, and you see these archways with these really decorative arches here, and we can see this line here, the top of this structure here lines up with this line, which takes you here. And you can see that this line lines up with that line, which takes you there. And if you looked at the pattern on the floor, we see that this line and this line, if we follow those back, they would also take you there. So there are a lot of converging parallel edges that take you back to a point between these two figures here, and that becomes kind of a focal point. So anyway, if we draw this vertical line down, we'll see that also the figurative groupings on the left and the right are paired and are in balance with one another. So you've got the same number, about the same shape of all these figures, about the same as you do here. And you've got a group of figures in the foreground here, and a group of figures on the foreground on that side, and a group of figures off to this side, and a group of figures off to this side, and a couple of people in the kind of intermediate foreground, and a couple of more there. So basically, what you've got is a symmetrical or near symmetrical composition. And this kind of balance emphasizes stability and order. And this this symmetry really becomes, in terms of art history, really becomes used in the Italian Renaissance. And this is the perfect example of that. So, as I said, we have symmetry and near symmetry, and strict symmetry is rare. Near symmetry is much more common. A bilateral composition like this drawing above by Alphonse Mucha is used in modern and contemporary art, and this is the very beginning of modern art. This is a sketch for an illustration. Mucha was an artist and illustrator who pioneered the Art Nouveau movement in the 19th century, and you'll probably will talk specifically about that a little bit later on. You notice that the figures are centrally located, and if you draw a line down the center and compare the two sides, they're not exact mirror images of one another. Now, this shape is completely symmetrical, and this shape is completely symmetrical, but when you look in these two figures here, they're centrally located, but they're not mirror images. So near symmetry is a lot more common. Asymmetry is a balance that is dynamic and achieved when dissimilar objects that have equal visual weight are placed in the composition to attract equal attention. Asymmetry is, I think, a lot more interesting and perhaps more difficult to assess. And it is something, of course, that it's difficult to find symmetry in the modern and contemporary art. So this is a ukiyo-e print by Utagawa Hiroshige, and this is Japanese art from the Edo period. And if we draw a vertical line through the center of this image, we see that the left and the right sides have similar elements but are arranged differently. Like they both have, figures, but those figures are not, they're placed differently. And they both have the larger geometric forms of the buildings, but they're not balanced in a symmetrical way. So this is asymmetry. And here's another example of asymmetrical balance, and it works in many different ways. The large can be paired with small, and dark with light, and bright with dull, and so on. In this case, in this ukiyo-e print, which is a woodcut print by Katsushika Hokusai, you see that you've got a very different sides. If we draw this line down here, you've got this mountain peak here, and the values are light against dark. And down here, it's lower placed, and it's actually dark in the background and light in the foreground. So there's a value reversal and a scale reversal on the two sides. And they're very different, but they have about the same amount of visual weight. If you look at it long enough, you'll find that your eye is drawn to here, and then it's drawn to here, and then back and forth, and you find yourself looking back and forth between these two places, and that's asymmetrical balance. Radial balance is easy to spot and remember. It is and it's not all that common. And when there is radial balance in a work of art, it certainly is immediately recognizable. Here's a collage by Fred Tomaselli, and the shapes radiate outward from the center. This kind of thing happens in nature, like patterns on a shell or something like that. You'll see a radial balance.